The alarm on my console screamed before I even understood what it meant. I had been sitting in that observation chair for 6 years, watching a wall of dead sensor feeds that never changed. My name is Vel Tarn, and my job was simple. Watch the edge of the quarantine zone. Report anything unusual. Nothing unusual ever happened. That was the entire point of my career. I was the quietest post in the entire Dravathi monitoring fleet, tucked into a forgotten corner of space, watching a border that nobody crossed because nobody was allowed to. Then, on an ordinary cycle, with my drink still warm beside me, every screen on my console turned red at once. I remember standing up so fast my chair spun behind me and hit the wall. My hands were shaking as I pulled up the source of the alert. A single vessel had crossed the boundary line. Not a probe, not debris. A full ship, moving with calm, deliberate speed, as if it had done this 1,000 times before. For a moment, I thought my equipment had failed. 200 years of silence does strange things to your mind. You start to believe the silence is permanent. You start to believe the thing you are guarding against does not actually exist anymore, that it died out, faded away, became nothing but a story told to frighten young cadets during training. I had begun to believe that too. I was wrong. I ran the identification scan 3 times, because I did not trust the first 2 results. Each time, the answer came back the same. The ship belonged to a species classification that had not appeared in any active monitoring log for over 2 centuries. A species that every record in our archive referred to using only one label, written in bright warning text at the top of every briefing file I had ever been given. Human. I sat back down slowly, my whole body cold. I had read about humans the way a child reads about a monster under the bed, half believing, half hoping it was exaggerated. The files said little about who they actually were. The files only said what they had done, and why an entire alliance of advanced civilizations had decided, after a war none of us liked to discuss, that the safest thing to do was seal an entire sector of space and never go back in. I opened a channel to my supervisor. My voice did not sound like my own. I told her what I was seeing. She did not believe me at first either. Then she pulled up the feed herself, and I heard her breath catch through the comm line. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said one word, quiet and tight. Confirmed. Within minutes, every light on the station core was active. People who had not left their sleeping quarters in hours were suddenly running through the corridors, half-dressed, demanding answers nobody had yet. I stayed at my post because nobody told me to move, and because honestly, I did not trust my legs to carry me anywhere useful. The ship continued forward. It did not accelerate. It did not change course. It moved exactly the way a vessel moves when the people inside it already know precisely where they are going and feel no need to hurry. That terrified me more than if it had been moving fast. A fast ship suggests fear, or aggression, or a mistake. A slow, steady ship suggests confidence. And confidence, after 200 years of being told this species was the most dangerous thing the galaxy had ever produced, was the last thing any of us wanted to see. I checked the weapons readings on the vessel out of habit, even though I already knew our scanners were not strong enough to read deep into a human hull. The files always said their technology had been crude back when the quarantine began, barely capable of short-range travel, nothing close to what the rest of the galaxy already had. That was actually part of why the original war frightened everyone so badly. A civilization with limited tools had still managed to fight 3 combined fleets to a stop before the boundary was sealed. Nobody wanted to imagine what 2 centuries of uninterrupted growth might have done to that same civilization. I was about to find out. A new signal appeared on my console. Not a weapons lock, not a distress call. A hailing request, broadcast on an open frequency, formatted in a way our systems could actually translate. I stared at it for a long moment before I realized what was strange about it. It was polite. The greeting included a standard identification code, a peaceful intent marker, and a simple request to speak with whoever was currently responsible for this section of space. No threats, no demands, no declarations, just a calm, ordinary request, the kind any normal traveling vessel might send when entering unfamiliar territory. I forwarded it immediately to command, my hands still trembling slightly on the controls. Then I sat there, staring at the dot on my screen that represented an entire civilization the galaxy had spent 200 years trying to forget existed. My supervisor came over the comm again. Her voice had changed. It was sharper now, more controlled, the voice of someone trying very hard not to sound as frightened as she clearly was. She told me the council had already been notified. An emergency session was being called, and then she said the part that made my stomach drop completely. She told me I was being requested by name, because I was one of the only people on this station who had ever studied the old human language files, back when I was a researcher long before I became a glorified screen watcher out here at the edge of nowhere. I asked her what that meant. She said it meant I was about to be much more important than either of us had ever expected me to be. I looked at the small dot on my screen one more time before I left my post. It had not slowed. It had not stopped. It continued forward, steady and sure, heading directly toward the heart of everything we had spent 2 centuries trying to protect. Whatever this was, it was not an accident. It was not a mistake. It was a choice, made by someone, somewhere on that vessel, who had decided that today was the day to step out of the silence. And as I walked toward the transport that would take me to the emergency session, one single thought kept repeating itself in my mind, louder than every alarm still echoing through the station behind me. They did not break out of the quarantine zone. They walked out of it, on their own terms, at a time of their own choosing. And nobody, not the council, not the fleet commanders, not even the historians who had written every warning file I had ever studied, seemed to have any idea why now, after 200 years of silence, was the moment they finally decided to come back. The emergency session chamber was already full by the time I arrived, and the noise inside it hit me before the doors even finished opening. Dozens of voices overlapped, each species speaking in its own clipped, panicked rhythm, translators struggling to keep pace with everyone talking at once. I had never seen the chamber this crowded. I had never seen it crowded at all, honestly. My only previous visit had been a tour during training, back when the room felt more like a museum than a place where real decisions were made. A junior aide grabbed my arm the moment I stepped inside and pulled me toward a side table stacked with old data files, their casings dusty from disuse. She told me the senior archivists wanted everything related to humans pulled and reviewed immediately, and since I was apparently the only person on station who had actually studied their language in any depth, I was now part of the review team. I did not feel qualified. I did not feel like I had a choice either. I sat down and began opening files I had not touched in years. Some of them I barely remembered translating during my research days. Reading them again now, with an actual human vessel sitting just outside our border, felt completely different than it had as an academic exercise. Back then, the words were just words. Now, every sentence felt like it was reaching forward through 2 centuries to warn me about something. The first file I opened was a summary report, written shortly before the original quarantine was approved. It described humanity, not as we had always assumed, a chaotic, disorganized species barely capable of basic cooperation, but as something far more unsettling. The report said that during the final conflict, a loose coalition of human nations, many of which still disagreed with each other on basic matters of governance, had somehow managed to unify just long enough to face down 3 allied fleets at once. 3 fleets, combined, from 3 separate advanced civilizations, each with technology far beyond what humanity supposedly possessed at the time. I read that line twice, certain I had mistranslated it. I had not. According to the report, the humans did not win that war. Nobody ever claimed they won, but they did not lose either. They held their ground long enough that the 3 allied civilizations, fearing a prolonged conflict none of them could afford, agreed to bring the matter before the wider council, instead of continuing the fight directly. That decision, made out of exhaustion rather than victory, was what led to the quarantine in the first place. I sat back in my chair, the data file glowing faintly in front of me, and tried to process what that actually meant. We had not quarantined humanity because they were weak. We had quarantined them because, even at their weakest recorded point, they were already strong enough to make 3 separate empires hesitate. A senior council member, an elder named Director Os Kethrin, called the chamber to order, his voice carrying clearly even through the layered murmurs of translation devices. I had only seen him in formal broadcasts before, never in person. Up close, he looked tired in a way broadcasts never showed, his expression carved into something between exhaustion and dread. He began by confirming what most of the room likely already suspected. The vessel had not deviated from its course. It continued moving steadily toward the inner boundary marker, the unofficial line beyond which our older monitoring stations had long since been decommissioned, considered unnecessary once the quarantine had held firm for so long. Nobody had expected to need them again. A representative from one of the founding species, an Olvanari elder with pale, layered skin and an old-fashioned formal manner of speaking, rose from her seat and asked the question I suspect everyone in the room was thinking, but had been too afraid to say aloud. She asked simply, "What do they want?" Director Kethrin did not answer immediately. He gestured instead toward the communications team, who replayed the hailing message the ship had sent earlier, the same one I had personally forwarded from my post. The chamber fell silent as the message played, the calm, simple tone of it somehow more disturbing now that it echoed through a room full of frightened leaders rather than just my small console screen. When it finished, nobody spoke for a long moment. Finally, a younger representative, someone from one of the newer member species who had joined the council long after the quarantine was already established, asked a question that made the entire room shift uncomfortably. He asked why, if humanity was truly as dangerous as the old records suggested, the council had allowed 2 full centuries to pass without ever attempting renewed contact, without ever trying to understand what had happened to them since the war ended, without doing anything except sealing a border and hoping it would hold forever. Director Kethrin's answer was quiet, but it carried through the chamber clearly. He said that fear does not require logic, it only requires memory, and the memory of that war had been more than enough to keep every successive council government from ever wanting to revisit it. I found myself thinking about that answer long after the session moved on to other matters. Fear without logic. That phrase stuck with me, because as I continued working through the old files at my table, I began to notice something that nobody else in the room seemed to be focusing on yet. The quarantine had never actually been about containing an active threat. It had been about avoiding an uncertain one. Nobody truly knew what humanity might become, given enough time and enough isolation. The council, faced with that uncertainty, had chosen the simplest possible solution: wall them in. Pretend the problem was solved. Move on with governing the rest of the galaxy and hope the matter never needed to be revisited. Now it was being revisited, whether anyone wanted it to be or not. A senior fleet commander stood and requested permission to mobilize additional ships toward the boundary, framing it as a precautionary measure rather than an aggressive one. Several council members nodded in support almost immediately, eager for something that felt like action rather than waiting. I noticed Director Kethrin hesitate before responding, his expression unreadable. He eventually agreed, though he added a clear condition. No weapons were to be used unless the human vessel initiated hostile action first. The council, he said firmly, would not be remembered as the side that broke a 200-year silence with violence, regardless of how frightened anyone in this room currently felt. I appreciated that condition more than I expected to. It told me something about the kind of leader Director Kethrin actually was, even surrounded by panic on every side. As the session continued, my own role in things became clearer. Since the human vessel had specifically requested communication, and since translators fluent in the old human language were almost non-existent within the current council structure, I was informed, somewhat abruptly, that I would be included on whatever team was eventually assigned to make first direct contact. I remember staring blankly at the official who delivered this news, certain there had to be some mistake. I was not a diplomat. I was not a negotiator. I was a low-ranking monitoring officer who happened to have studied an obscure dead language during a research phase of my career that I had mostly abandoned years ago. The idea that I might soon be standing face to face with an actual human felt less like an honor and more like a sentence. But there was no one to argue with, and honestly, looking around that chamber full of frightened, important people, I am not sure anyone else wanted the position badly enough to fight me for it. The session continued for hours. Strategies were debated. History was reread and reread again, each pass revealing some new detail nobody had bothered to highlight during the original quarantine discussions, buried so deep in old archives that an entire generation of leadership had simply never read them. One detail in particular stayed with me the rest of that day. Buried near the end of one of the older reports was a single line, almost an afterthought, written by a researcher whose name I did not recognize. It noted that human communication patterns, even during active conflict, consistently showed an unusual tendency toward direct, almost blunt honesty, especially when compared to the more layered, careful diplomatic styles common among most council species. The researcher had written it almost as a curiosity, a strange cultural quirk worth noting for future study. Sitting there now, knowing a human vessel was steadily approaching our border with calm, deliberate intent, that single line felt less like a curiosity and more like a warning we had simply failed to take seriously enough at the time. If humans truly communicated with blunt honesty, even under pressure, then whatever they intended to say to us once contact was made would likely be exactly what they meant, with no hidden layers, no diplomatic softening, no comforting ambiguity to hide behind. I was not sure if that thought made me feel better or worse. By the time the session finally adjourned, the chamber had grown quieter, exhaustion replacing some of the earlier panic. Director Catherine remained behind after most of the others had left, standing near the central display where the slow, steady dot, representing the human vessel, continued its calm path forward. I lingered near the doorway longer than I probably should have, watching him. He did not look like a man preparing for a fight. He looked like a man preparing to apologize for something, though I could not yet understand what that something might be. He noticed me eventually, and asked if I had any final thoughts before the contact team assignments were formally finalized. I told him honestly that I did not know what to expect, that everything I had studied about humans came from records written by people who had only ever seen them through the narrow lens of conflict, never through ordinary interaction. He nodded slowly, considering that for a long moment before responding. He said that might end up being the most useful thing any of us brought into that meeting, a mind without preconceived expectations, ready to actually listen rather than simply react out of inherited fear. I did not feel particularly ready for anything as I left the chamber that night, but as I walked back toward my temporary quarters, passing crews still working frantically to prepare additional monitoring equipment along the corridor, I kept thinking about that single line from the old research file. Blunt honesty, even under pressure. If that was true, then tomorrow, when our small contact team finally stood face to face with the crew of that vessel, we would not be facing diplomatic games or hidden agendas. We would simply be hearing, for the first time in 200 years, exactly what humanity actually wanted to say to the rest of us. And somehow, that simple thought frightened me more than anything else I had learned that entire day. The transport shuttle ride toward the human vessel was the longest 20 minutes of my entire life. There were 4 of us on the contact team. Director Catherine had insisted on joining personally, against the strong objections of nearly every security advisor in the chamber, arguing that sending a senior representative showed respect rather than weakness. Beside him sat Commander Leora Hask, a sharp-eyed Dravathi officer assigned to oversee security protocols, though she had been told explicitly that no weapons were to be carried openly during the meeting. And then there was Baron Ashu, a younger logistics officer whose presence I still did not fully understand, though I suspected he was there mainly to document everything for the official record. And finally, me, clutching a small translation device and trying very hard not to let my hands shake. Nobody spoke much during the flight. The silence inside that shuttle felt heavier than any noise could have been. When the human vessel finally filled our viewport, I found myself staring at it longer than I probably should have. It was not as large as I had expected, certainly smaller than most council capital ships, but there was something about its design that unsettled me in a way size alone never could have. Every line of the hull looked efficient, deliberate, built without a single wasted feature. No ornamental markings, no elaborate decoration meant to project status or wealth the way most council vessels did. Just clean, functional design, the kind that suggested the people who built it cared far more about results than appearances. A docking signal appeared on our shuttle console, polite and procedural, guiding us toward a small entry bay near the lower section of the hull. Commander Hask muttered something under her breath about the precision of the guidance signal, noting quietly that it matched almost exactly the docking standards used by several council shipyards, despite humanity having no recorded contact with any of those shipyards in over 200 years. I did not have an answer for her. I was beginning to realize that very few of us had answers for much of anything happening that day. The shuttle docked with a soft, barely perceptible clamp, and for a long moment none of us moved. Then the outer hatch cycled open, and Director Catherine straightened his robes, took a slow breath, and stepped forward first. I followed close behind him, my translation device gripped tightly in one hand. The interior of the human vessel surprised me immediately. I had expected something cold, sterile, perhaps even intimidating in its starkness, given everything the old files had warned about humanity's supposed harsh efficiency. Instead, the corridor we entered felt almost ordinary. Warm lighting, simple, practical furnishings, a faint hum of working machinery in the background, the kind of sound that suggested a ship in good operating condition, rather than one preparing for confrontation. A single figure waited for us near the end of the corridor, standing with relaxed, easy posture, hands folded calmly in front of her. She introduced herself as Captain Elena Marsh, commanding officer of the vessel. Her voice was steady, unhurried, carrying none of the tension I had braced myself to encounter. She greeted Director Catherine with a polite nod, then turned her attention briefly to the rest of us, offering the same simple greeting to each in turn. I activated my translation device out of habit, though I quickly realized her words were already being rendered in a passable approximation of our own diplomatic language, spoken through a small device clipped neatly to her collar. The realization hit me with quiet force. They had prepared for this meeting. They had prepared, perhaps, for a very long time. Captain Marsh led us further into the ship, toward what she described simply as a meeting room. Along the way, I noticed several crew members going about ordinary tasks, none of them paying our group more than a brief, curious glance before returning to their work. There was no visible alarm among them, no tension in their movements, just calm, practiced routine, as though hosting representatives from an entire galactic council was simply another item on their daily schedule. The meeting room itself was simple: a round table, comfortable seating, a single large viewport showing the stars outside, unobstructed by any defensive shielding or tactical display. If this was meant to be an intimidation tactic, it was unlike any I had ever studied. There was no power display here, no show of force, only calm, quiet confidence, which somehow felt far more unsettling than any weapon could have. We sat. Captain Marsh remained standing for a moment longer, glancing briefly toward the viewport, before finally taking her own seat across from Director Catherine. She began without much preamble, her tone measured and direct. She said that her people had detected a buildup of Council fleet movement near the outer edge of the quarantine zone over the past several months, far beyond what would normally be expected for routine border monitoring. She said this buildup had continued steadily, week after week, despite no formal communication being sent to explain it. I felt the room shift slightly at that statement. Director Catherine's expression remained carefully neutral, though I noticed his hands tighten slightly where they rested on the table. Captain Marsh continued, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. She said her people had a simple policy. When unexplained military activity increases near their home territory, they prefer to ask directly, rather than wait passively to discover the reason after the fact. I translated her words quietly for my own notes, though I barely needed to. Her meaning was clear enough without any additional interpretation. They had not crossed the boundary out of aggression. They had crossed it because they wanted an answer, delivered face to face, to a question that had apparently been troubling them for some time. Director Catherine took a long moment before responding. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the careful weight of someone choosing each word with extreme caution. He explained that the fleet movements were part of a broader Council security review, conducted periodically along all major boundary zones, including but not limited to the quarantine border. He assured her that no specific action had been authorized against her people, and that the increased activity reflected general policy rather than any targeted intention. Captain Marsh listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable. When he finished, she allowed a brief silence to settle over the table before responding. She said, simply, that she appreciated the explanation, though she noted, almost gently, that her people had learned long ago to pay closer attention to actions than to explanations, especially when those explanations arrived only after direct questioning, rather than through any voluntary communication. I felt the temperature of the room shift again, though nothing about her tone had actually changed. She was not angry. She was not threatening. She was simply stating, plainly and without embellishment, exactly what she believed to be true. Commander Hask shifted slightly in her seat beside me, and I noticed her eyes flick briefly toward the viewport, as though searching for some sign of hidden threat among the stars outside. I understood the instinct. I felt it too. But nothing about the room suggested an imminent confrontation. If anything, the calm itself was the most unsettling part of the entire exchange. Captain Marsh continued, shifting the conversation slightly. She asked, with the same simple directness she had used throughout, what specific concerns had prompted the Council's renewed attention toward the quarantine boundary after 2 centuries of relative inactivity. I watched Director Kethrin carefully as he considered his answer. This was the question, I realized, that the entire emergency session the previous day had ultimately been trying to avoid confronting directly. The honest answer was fear. Fear of what humanity might have become during 200 years of uninterrupted growth. Fear of losing the fragile sense of control the quarantine had provided for so long. But admitting that openly, here, in this room, felt like an impossible thing to do. Director Kethrin chose his words carefully, framing the renewed interest as part of a routine historical review, rather than any specific concern. Captain Marsh listened politely, though I noticed something subtle in her expression, something that suggested she recognized the careful diplomatic framing for exactly what it was. She did not press the point further, at least not immediately. Instead, she turned the conversation toward more practical matters, asking about the current state of relations between various council member species, the general structure of galactic governance as it now existed, and several other broad questions that felt almost academic in nature, as though she were simply trying to update an outdated understanding of the wider galaxy. I found myself relaxing slightly as the conversation continued in this direction, though something in the back of my mind refused to fully settle. Her questions were too precise, too organized, as though she already had a clear framework in mind and was simply filling in specific details rather than building genuine new understanding from nothing. It was Baron, the quiet logistics officer, who had said almost nothing throughout the entire meeting, who finally voiced the question that had been sitting uncomfortably in my own thoughts. He asked, somewhat hesitantly, how her people had managed to develop translation technology sophisticated enough to render council diplomatic language so fluently, given that humanity had supposedly had no contact whatsoever with any council species since the original quarantine began. The room went very quiet. Captain Marsh held his gaze for a long moment before answering, her expression calm but unmistakably deliberate. She said simply that her people had spent the last 2 centuries doing far more than most outside observers likely assumed. I felt a cold weight settle into my chest at those words, though I could not yet fully articulate why. Director Kethrin's expression remained controlled, but I noticed the slight stiffening in his posture, the same subtle tension I had seen earlier when she first mentioned the fleet buildup. Captain Marsh allowed the silence to stretch a moment longer before continuing, her tone still calm, still measured, but carrying an undeniable weight now that had not been present at the start of the conversation. She said that humanity had not spent the last 200 years simply existing quietly, inside an isolated sector of space, waiting passively for the rest of the galaxy to decide their fate. She said they had spent that time learning, watching, listening, carefully and patiently, to whatever fragments of outside communication occasionally reached the edges of their territory, piecing together a picture of the wider galaxy, far more detailed than anyone among us had likely expected. I exchanged a brief glance with Director Kethrin, and I could see in his expression the same realization beginning to form in my own mind. This meeting was not simply a polite introduction after 2 centuries of silence. It was the moment we were finally being shown exactly how much they already knew. Director Kethrin asked, carefully, exactly what she meant by that statement. Captain Marsh reached toward a small panel, built into the table in front of her, tapping it gently. A soft glow rose above the surface, forming a simple display that hovered between us. I leaned forward slightly, my breath catching as the image resolved into something I recognized immediately. It was a star chart, our star chart, showing the Council's current territorial boundaries with a level of detail that should have been entirely inaccessible to anyone outside official Council records. She said calmly that this map represented current Council territory as of approximately 3 months ago, compiled from passive monitoring conducted entirely from within their own quarantined sector, using equipment built using their own independent research. I stared at the display, trying to process what she was actually claiming. Passive monitoring from within the quarantine boundary should have been impossible at this level of detail. Our own sensors barely reached the edges of human territory, and that was using equipment built with the combined resources of an entire Council alliance. Commander Hask spoke up for the first time since we had entered the room, her voice carrying a sharp edge of disbelief. She asked how, exactly, a single isolated sector with no outside contact had managed to develop sensor technology capable of reaching this far beyond their own borders. Captain Marsh's answer was simple, almost matter-of-fact in its delivery. She said that isolation, in her experience, tended to produce two very different outcomes, depending entirely on how a civilization chose to respond to it. Some species, cut off from outside contact, gradually stagnated, their development slowing, without external pressure or competition to drive continued progress. Others, faced with the same isolation, treated it instead as an extended period of uninterrupted focus, free from the usual distractions and conflicts that came with constant outside interaction. She said her people had chosen the second path, deliberately and with full awareness of what it might eventually mean. I felt the weight of that statement settle over the entire room. 2 centuries of focused, uninterrupted development, conducted entirely outside the watchful awareness of the rest of the galaxy. No outside competition slowing their progress. No diplomatic obligations consuming their resources. Just steady, continuous advancement, hidden behind a boundary the Council itself had created and then largely forgotten to actively monitor. Director Kethrin asked, his voice noticeably more careful now, what specifically that 2 centuries of focused development had produced. Captain Marsh considered the question for a long moment before answering. When she finally spoke, her tone remained calm, almost gentle, though the content of her words carried an unmistakable weight. She said that her people currently possessed detailed knowledge of nearly every major Council fleet movement over the past several decades, gathered through a combination of passive long-range monitoring and careful analysis of communication patterns intercepted near the boundary edge. She said this knowledge had allowed them to track, with reasonable accuracy, the gradual buildup of forces near their territory over recent months, long before any of us in this room had likely become aware of how closely they had been observing it themselves. I felt my translation device nearly slip from my hand. Around the table, I could see similar reactions mirrored on every face except Captain Marsh's own steady, composed expression. Baron, still visibly shaken from his earlier question, asked quietly why, if her people had been capable of this level of monitoring for so long, they had chosen to remain silent rather than reaching out sooner, especially once they began noticing increased military activity along their border. Captain Marsh's answer came without hesitation, as though she had anticipated the question long before it was asked. She said her people had learned, through long study of available historical records, that the original quarantine decision had been driven largely by fear rather than any specific ongoing threat. She said they had no desire to provoke that same fear unnecessarily by revealing themselves too soon, especially while the underlying reasons for renewed Council attention toward their border remained unclear. She said they had chosen, instead, to wait, to continue observing quietly, gathering information, until either the situation resolved itself naturally, or until the buildup became significant enough that direct communication became necessary rather than optional. She said that point had been reached 3 days ago, when fleet movement patterns shifted in a way that suggested preparation for something beyond routine border monitoring. The room went completely silent. I looked toward Director Kethrin, watching the careful composure on his face begin to strain slightly under the weight of what was being implied. 3 days ago, I tried to recall what had happened within Council command structures around that time frame, and a cold, uncomfortable memory surfaced almost immediately. 3 days ago, a closed session had been held among senior fleet commanders, one that had not been shared with the wider diplomatic body, myself included. I had only heard fragments about it afterward, vague references to contingency planning that nobody seemed willing to discuss in detail. Director Kethrin's expression told me he remembered that session as well, and that he understood exactly what Captain Marsh was suggesting. Commander Hask broke the silence first, her voice tight with barely restrained tension. She asked directly what specific fleet movement pattern had prompted such an urgent response from their side. Captain Marsh held her gaze steadily before answering. She said that 3 days ago, several Council vessels had begun adjusting their formation in a manner consistent with preparation for coordinated offensive action, rather than the standard defensive patrol patterns maintained throughout the rest of the build-up period. I felt my stomach drop entirely at those words. Director Catherine's composure finally cracked, just slightly, his hands tightening visibly on the table in front of him. He said, carefully, that he was not personally aware of any authorization for offensive action against the quarantine boundary, and that such a decision, if it existed, would have required approval well beyond his own current authority. Captain Marsh nodded slowly, her expression neither accusing nor entirely convinced. She said that she believed him. She said she did not necessarily believe the same could be said for everyone currently holding decision-making power within the Council's broader command structure. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a physical pressure. I found myself thinking back to the emergency session the day before, to the fleet commander, who had requested additional ships be mobilized toward the boundary, framing it as a precautionary measure. I thought about how quickly several council members had agreed to that request, eager for something resembling decisive action after years of uncertainty surrounding the quarantine's long-term future. Had that request actually been about something more than precaution? Had there been discussions happening at levels above my own awareness, decisions made in rooms I had never been invited into, planning for exactly the kind of action Captain Marsh was now describing? I did not know. And in that moment, sitting in that quiet, calmly lit meeting room, aboard a human vessel that had apparently been watching us far more closely than we had ever watched them, I realized something that frightened me more than anything in the old historical files ever had. The danger here was never going to be humanity acting first. The danger was that someone within our own council, frightened enough by 2 centuries of unresolved uncertainty, might have already decided to act first themselves, and that decision might have nearly triggered exactly the kind of conflict everyone in that emergency chamber had spent the entire previous day desperately trying to avoid. Captain Marsh allowed the silence to stretch for a long moment before speaking again, her voice softer now, though no less firm in its underlying conviction. She said her people had not crossed the boundary today seeking conflict. She said they had crossed it because waiting any longer, while unclear and potentially hostile fleet movements continued building near their home, was no longer an acceptable option. She said she hoped, sincerely, that this conversation would be enough to resolve the misunderstanding peacefully. But she also made clear, in the same calm, direct manner she had used throughout the entire meeting, that her people would not simply return to passive silence and wait quietly for whatever decision the council ultimately reached behind closed doors. She said the silence was over. Whatever happened next would happen with both sides fully aware of each other, watching openly rather than hiding behind 2 centuries of carefully maintained distance. Director Catherine sat quietly for a long moment, processing everything that had just been revealed. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight I had not heard from him before, something between exhaustion and a strange, reluctant respect. He said that he understood. He said he would need to bring this information back to the full council immediately, and that serious questions would need to be answered regarding exactly who within the current command structure had authorized the offensive formation Captain Marsh had described. Captain Marsh nodded once, accepting his response without further comment. As our meeting drew to a close, and we prepared to return to our shuttle, I found myself looking back one final time at the calm, steady confidence radiating from every member of that human crew we passed along the corridor. They had spent 2 centuries watching us from behind a boundary we ourselves had built. They had grown, quietly and deliberately, into something far more capable than any of our old historical records had prepared us to expect. And somewhere within our own council, hidden behind closed doors and private sessions I had never been allowed to attend, someone had apparently come dangerously close to deciding that the safest response to that growth was to strike first, before we ever had the chance to understand what humanity had actually become. As the shuttle doors closed behind us and we began our return journey toward the council station, I could not shake the feeling that the true danger we now faced had very little to do with the people we had just left behind on that vessel. It had everything to do with the people waiting for us back home. The return session was even more crowded than the first, word having spread quickly through the station about what our contact team had reported back during the initial debrief. By the time Director Catherine stood to address the full chamber, every available seat was filled, and even the standing areas along the back walls were packed tightly with aides, advisors, and representatives, who normally would never have been granted access to a session of this importance. I stood near the front of the room, still holding the small translation device I had carried throughout the entire meeting aboard the human vessel, my thoughts replaying every detail of that conversation over and over, searching for anything I might have missed. Director Catherine began by laying out exactly what Captain Marsh had revealed, sparing no detail, including the most uncomfortable part of the entire report. He explained that human monitoring capability extended far beyond anything the Council had previously assumed possible, and that their detection of a shift toward offensive fleet formation 3 days earlier had been the direct trigger for their decision to finally cross the boundary themselves. The chamber erupted into overlapping voices almost immediately, demands for clarification mixing with outright denial from several fleet representatives who insisted no such authorization had ever been approved through proper channels. It was the senior fleet commander, the same one who had originally requested additional ships be mobilized during the first emergency session, who finally stood and admitted, with visible reluctance, that a smaller contingency group within Fleet Command had indeed begun preparing offensive formation protocols, framing it internally as a worst-case defensive measure rather than an active first strike plan. The room went deathly quiet at that admission. Director Catherine asked, directly and without any diplomatic softening, who specifically had authorized that contingency planning, and at what level of Council oversight it had been approved. The commander's answer revealed exactly what I had feared during the shuttle ride back. The planning had been conducted within a small, closed group of senior fleet officials, operating under emergency authority, granted during a private session 2 weeks earlier. One convened specifically to discuss long-term concerns regarding the quarantine boundary, separate from the wider diplomatic body entirely. In other words, a small group of frightened officials, acting largely outside proper Council oversight, had come dangerously close to initiating exactly the kind of conflict that could have ended any possibility of peaceful resolution before it ever truly began. I watched the Olvenari elder who had spoken during the first session rise slowly to her feet, her expression carrying a controlled but unmistakable fury. She asked how, after everything the Council claimed to have learned from the original conflict 2 centuries ago, anyone could have believed that secretly preparing for renewed hostility, without proper oversight or transparency, was an acceptable path forward. Nobody in the chamber offered a satisfying answer. Director Catherine allowed the silence to stretch for a long moment before speaking again, his voice carrying a quiet, deliberate weight that finally seemed to settle the room. He said that fear, left unchecked and unexamined, tends to convince people that secrecy is safety, when in reality, it almost always produces the exact danger it was originally meant to prevent. He said that today, that exact pattern had nearly repeated itself, 200 years after the lessons of the original conflict should have made such a mistake impossible to imagine. He proposed, formally and immediately, that all contingency planning related to offensive action near the quarantine boundary be suspended at once, and that a new framework be established for direct, transparent communication with the human delegation, conducted openly before the full Council, rather than through closed sessions hidden from proper oversight. The proposal passed with remarkable speed, far faster than I had ever seen any major Council decision move before. Fear, it seemed, was an excellent motivator once its consequences had nearly come due. Over the following days, I found myself increasingly involved in the new communication framework, my modest language skills suddenly in high demand as formal negotiations began in earnest. Captain Marsh returned for several follow-up sessions, each one conducted openly, with full Council representation present, rather than the small closed group from our first meeting. I watched, almost with disbelief, as 2 centuries of accumulated fear slowly began giving way to something resembling cautious, structured dialogue. It was not easy. Many Council representatives remained deeply uncomfortable with the idea of treating humanity as an equal, rather than a contained threat to be carefully managed from a safe distance. Old habits, built over 200 years of careful avoidance, did not disappear overnight, simply because direct conversation had finally become possible. But slowly, session by session, progress was made. Humanity, it turned out, was not seeking territorial expansion beyond their existing sector, nor any form of dominance over the wider Council structure. Their primary request, repeated consistently and without variation across multiple negotiation sessions, was simple. They wanted recognition as an equal, sovereign presence within the galaxy, free from the quiet, contained isolation that had defined their existence for the past 2 centuries. They wanted the quarantine designation formally lifted, replaced instead with standard diplomatic relations extended to any other recognized council member species. It was, honestly, a far more modest request than most of us had expected, given everything the old historical files had warned us to fear. I remember sitting in one of the later negotiation sessions, watching Captain Marsh calmly answer yet another round of cautious, carefully worded questions from council representatives, still struggling to fully trust the situation. I found myself thinking back to that very first line I had read in the old research file, the one describing humanity's tendency toward blunt, direct honesty even under pressure. That description had proven entirely accurate throughout every single interaction I witnessed. There had been no hidden agendas, no manipulative diplomatic tricks, just calm, consistent honesty, delivered plainly, even when the truth being shared was deeply uncomfortable for everyone else in the room to hear. Eventually, after weeks of careful negotiation, a formal agreement was reached. The quarantine zone designation was officially dissolved, replaced with full diplomatic recognition of humanity as an independent, sovereign member of the wider galactic community. New communication channels were established. Trade discussions, still cautious and limited, began for the first time in 2 centuries, and perhaps most significantly, an independent oversight committee was created specifically to monitor any future contingency planning involving newly recognized member species, ensuring that the kind of secretive, fear-driven decision-making that had nearly triggered renewed conflict could never happen again without proper transparency. I was present during the final signing ceremony, standing quietly near the back of the room as Director Catherine and Captain Marsh formally exchanged the completed agreement documents. It was a remarkably understated event, given the historical weight of what it actually represented. No grand celebration, no elaborate ceremony, just 2 representatives, from 2 civilizations, that had spent 200 years, defined entirely by fear and distance, finally choosing instead to move forward through honest, direct communication. After the ceremony concluded, Captain Marsh approached me briefly before departing, a small gesture I had not expected given how minor my own role had ultimately been throughout the entire process. She thanked me, simply and directly, for the care I had taken translating not just her people's words, but their actual intended meaning, during conversations where misunderstanding could easily have led to far worse outcomes. I told her honestly that I had spent most of those negotiations more frightened than useful. She smiled slightly at that, the first genuinely warm expression I had seen from her throughout the entire process, and told me that fear, handled carefully, was not actually a weakness. It was simply proof that the situation had mattered enough to take seriously. I have thought about that conversation often in the months since. My life has changed considerably since that first alarm sounded on my quiet monitoring console. I no longer sit watching empty sensor feeds at the edge of forgotten space. I now work within the newly established diplomatic office, responsible for ongoing relations with humanity, a position I never could have imagined holding during all those quiet years guarding a border everyone assumed would remain silent forever. Looking back now, I understand something I did not fully grasp during those first terrifying days. Humanity never actually emerged from the quarantine zone as some uncontrolled, dangerous threat finally breaking free after 2 centuries of restraint. They emerged carefully, deliberately, on their own terms. Only after years of patient observation had convinced them the moment had finally arrived when silence was no longer the safer choice. The true danger the Council faced was never humanity itself. It was the fear we had allowed to grow unchecked within our own structures. Fear that nearly led a small group of frightened officials toward exactly the kind of conflict that wisdom, transparency, and honest communication ultimately proved capable of avoiding entirely. 200 years of silence ended not with violence, but with a single, calm, direct question, delivered plainly by people who had simply grown tired of waiting quietly for an answer that never came. And somewhere out among the stars, beyond the boundary that no longer separates us, humanity continues moving forward, steady and confident, No longer hidden behind walls the rest of the galaxy built out of fear 2 centuries ago. I, for one, am glad I finally got the chance to truly meet them.
You're good, you're good. Left hash. Left hash. Left hash. You got me. Oh! He missed. Oh, he didn't. We're good. We're not gonna lose this game, I promise. People don't know what to do.